My name is Brock, and this is the Dungeon Master's Toolkit Podcast. Since we had Hanker and Fernell on last week, I thought this episode might be a good time to talk about ICRPG, a little bit about how it plays, and then mechanics that you can steal from ICRPG. Let's start off with how you actually play ICRPG so you guys can get a feel for the system. If you're familiar with a game like Dungeons & Dragons, especially 5th edition, this should be pretty familiar to you. There are 6 core stats: strength, constitution, dexterity, wisdom, intelligence, and charisma, all the same things that you would have in Dungeons & Dragons. And your rolling is similar as well for checks. You're rolling a d20, you are adding a modifier to your roll, and you're seeing if you beat a target number. One of the simplifications in the target number is that the Game Master sets a difficulty for the encounter. So the Game Master might choose a number like 12. And any roll, whether it's attacking enemies or it's trying to jump over something or a strength check or whatever, anything that any check that you have to make has to be against that target number. So it simplifies things a little bit, similar to the Powered by the Apocalypse games where you already know what the target is. It's just kind of baked in. In this situation, the GM does get to choose what it is, and he talks a little bit about how you should kind of increase this as things get more difficult. There's also a little mechanic called easy and hard, which basically is a -3 to the difficulty for easy or a +3 to the difficulty for hard. You could simply replace this with the advantage mechanic from D&D and you would be set. But really, for any given encounter, you're always rolling against the same target number. But in comparison to something like Dungeons & Dragons, this is pretty familiar. It's a d20 check, you're adding a modifier, and you're good to go. We can also talk a little bit about movement in the game. Very similar to a D&D game, you have kind of these small range bands. So you've got close, near, far, and basically what I like to think of it is near is kind of like your 30 feet, right? So that's kind of a standard movement amount in D&D. Far would be twice that, so 2 times near, so about 60 feet or so. The game doesn't specifically measure things out in feet. It's just kind of an abstract how much you think or how much space you think there should be. I believe in the book he also mentions about near distance is about the length of a banana on like a standard battle map, right? Or about like the length of your hand if you stretch your fingers out. So you can kind of quickly gauge distances. It's not super exact, but there is a little bit of kind of a range band or range of measurements. And then close is just like if you're standing next to somebody and you can hit them with the sword, you're like 5-ish feet away. So that's all pretty standard. It's not down to the foot, but it's just kind of distances that make sense. Now we're going to get into the first mechanic that I think is really stealable, and it's something that I'm kind of surprised doesn't show up in games like D&D, and that is the kind of effort system and the attempts. Now, in a game of D&D, you have both of these rolls, though they're not quite named like this. You have a standard check. So that's kind of like you want to run and jump across a gap, right? You probably have to make a dexterity check. And if you pass, you made the jump. If you fail, then you didn't make the jump or something else happened, right? That's kind of your standard check. Commonly, this is used for charisma checks too. Like I want to convince somebody to do something. It's just a check. It's just a pass-fail. And that's it. There's nothing else involved with that. Now, you also have the second type of check, which in ICRPG is called an attempt, where you roll your dice to see if you do a thing, but then you also have to roll more dice to see how well you do the thing. And in D&D, that would be a combat roll, right? If you're attacking something with a sword, you roll your d20, you add your modifiers. If you hit, then you also roll your damage dice. Now, this is the part that I think can be kind of stolen from, is that Hankgren expands on this with effort. So if you think about the monster as having an amount of health, and then that damage roll is your effort roll. It's how much effort you succeeded at the thing. Now you're trying to see how much effort you can get into that task, essentially. So in the case of an attack roll, that effort is represented by damage to the monster. Once you've done enough effort to the monster, enough damage to the monster, you have, killed the monster or knocked it out. But the thing that's neat here is that he expands this into just attempts, and then this can be used for more things than just combat. And this is something that I think you could steal into a D&D game. Again, I'm surprised it's not in there. So one example would be having a lock. Maybe it's a really difficult lock, and so you set the lock as having, 10 HP, 10 effort. That's kind of the amount it takes to break through the lock. Now, when your rogue is trying to pick the lock, they've got to do their dexterity check and use their tools. If they succeed, now they get to roll effort. Now they're working towards getting that lock open. They might not get it on the first try. They could roll a critical and get to roll extra and put extra effort into completing this thing and complete it really quickly. But there are so many things that you can use with effort and attempts. For example, so we had the lock pick, we have damage, that's the common one. You could also use this for like social combat or social interactions, right? Like if you're trying to convince the king to give you like a platoon of soldiers to help you with something, it's probably not just that pass, fail, yes, no, like we often see in D&D. This could be, that could be a very difficult thing to convince him, and you might have to try to convince him by making multiple charisma checks over the course of like multiple days while you're staying, in the vicinity. And you're slowly working on trying to like, come on, this is what we need. You get more evidence, you get to roll with advantage and stuff. And there's these things that you can start kind of building these different encounters on by including effort instead of just having a single pass-fail check where the king just says, oh yeah, sure, I'll just give you my army, or just kind of spits in your face and is like, no, there's a little bit more of a range that you can go here. And this actually kind of reminds me of the clocks in Blades in the Dark, where it's kind of the same idea, is that as you're making progress on something, you're kind of marking that progress down towards completing that goal. And in some situations, you may be able to reverse that progress. So in the case of the king, trying to convince the king, if you fail a check, like you botch it really bad, the DM might make you roll your effort and then subtract that amount from the effort because you really ticked him off and now he really doesn't want to help you anymore. Or kind of the same thing with like monsters, right? Monsters can heal damage done to them if they have certain abilities or items. So in that same regard, a attempt, something that needs effort to be completed, can also be set back by kind of healing it or something that would just pull back that effort. Now here's where things start to kind of shift a little bit from how they would be in, say, a D&D game, in that you have a couple different types of effort that you can do, that your character can do. And this basically determines what dice you roll when you're determining how much effort you do towards a given attempt. So the basic one is basic work. It's a D4. It's when you're just using like your bare hands, your wits. You don't really have much going on to be unarmed fighters, or you don't have the tool for the job, essentially. It's a D4. So even if you succeed, you're not making a lot of progress. And I will mention, these are stats. These are modifiable. So you can put points into your basic work or your weapon damage to bump those up, so that maybe if I put a bunch of my stat points into basic work, I might be only rolling a D4, but I might add 4 points on as well. So that's actually ends up being pretty good. The second one is a D6, that's weapon damage, and I kind of like to lump tools in here as well. So in the book, it mentions swords, spears, bows, axes, whatever. Any type of weapon, and like I said, I also like to add in tools, so like lockpick tools, or like if you've got like some type of crafting gear, or any specialty tool that's meant for a job, lockpicks, that sort of a thing. That's when I would say, okay, now you can roll your weapon or tool damage or tool, effort for that. And then your next one is a D8, and that is magical effect. So any type of magic does a D8. And so this is just kind of saying like magic is strong, it's crazy, it's really good. Now, there's a little bit of a note that got added in here between like, okay, what if I have a magical weapon? Do I roll the magic dice or do I roll the weapon dice? And basically what it says in the book is whichever bonus you have is better, that's better, you use that one. So like if you have your weapon damage and you have like +3 in it, but you don't have anything in your magical effect bonuses, then if you're using a magical sword, you would use the D6 instead of the D8. Vice versa, if you had more in the magical effect side, then you could use the magic one. It really comes down to personal choice, really, and it kind of depends on how you build your characters, because if you're like some type of a fighter, you're probably putting more of your points into weapon damage because that's going to be important earlier on in the game. But then if you grab a magical sword, you don't want to be like, oh, well, now I can't use this, or it's kind of had this weird thing. And actually, if I'm reading this right, I think you get to use whichever modifier is better. So if you get a magical sword, your dice upgrades to a D8 automatically, and then if you had a bunch of bonuses to your weapon damage, you get to use that along with your D8. Yes, I misread that. So you don't like lose your progress if you find a magical sword, because that would just be weird. And then the last option that you can roll for effort is the D12, and that is ultimate. And basically what that means, that's like your critical hit. So if you roll a 20 on an attempt, you get to also add a D12 to whatever your other effort one was, if you were doing basic work, weapon damage, or magical effects. So it really bumps up the amount of effort you do. You don't roll double of like in D&D, you just like roll everything twice. In this case, you just get to add a D12, which is better than everything else that you have anyways. As a side note, you can also put stat points into ultimate effort, which makes your critical hits hit a lot harder. So if you've got like a rogue or somebody who is trying to get criticals a lot, and you want to do more critical damage, essentially, you can put points into ultimate. I would probably put it into something that's a little bit more consistent, but you can do it if you want to. So that is attempts and effort, and it's a system that, to me, it makes a lot of sense. And like I said, it's weird that it's not in D&D, because the core combat checks in D&D they're just attempts. This is just like the extrapolation of that into non-combat roles, right? It's just giving a task a certain amount of health and then having to roll some kind of a dice to figure out how well or how much progress you make. Now, the kind of tricky part for porting this over to a game like D&D is that now you have to assign dice, like damage dice, effort dice, to different tools. How much do tools do? How much does basic work? Is it still a D4? Is it, if you're using a weapon, is it a D6 or a tool or whatever? You can kind of make some generalizations to port this over. Is probably what I would do, is just say tools are, your weapons are the same as whatever weapon damage they are normally, and then your tools are D6s, and, leave basic. You probably can port it over pretty much as is. It's just that like the tools and stuff don't have specific dice associated with them as is. Now that we've talked about the effort pieces, and we mentioned that you can actually allocate stat points at character creation into bonuses for your effort, you may realize, hey, wait a minute, I play D&D and all the weapons do have a different damage dice. And it sounds like if in ICRPG, I just roll a d6 for everything. That seems kind of weird, right? Well, ICRPG kind of takes the same route that Dungeon World does, where Dungeon World, and I don't know that these are necessarily inspired from each other. I read ICRPG first and then found Dungeon World afterwards, but similarities here. ICRPG takes the weapons and puts all the damage together as d6s, right? And same thing with Dungeon World. Dungeon World just takes it and bases it on your class. If you're a fighter, you do more damage, you roll a bigger dice. If you're a wizard, you suck at combat and you roll a d4. That's just the way life is. Get over it. The thing that makes weapons and equipment unique is that they have different tags on them that have, different properties. Like a dagger, it's concealable, it's fast, it's piercing, and it can be thrown, right? That's very different than something like a halberd, which is, a polearm. It has a longer reach, it's big, or even like a spear. They're simple, they're long, they're durable, they can be thrown. And the differences that you get come from the tag, and what you can do with them come from the tag. The damage, the specific dice used for the damage is not that important. And honestly, looking at all of the different damage dices, or the damage dice in D&D, they may all be different, but they're all super close, right? Like the difference between a D4 and a D6 on average is 1. So, going up with like different dice sizes and whatever, it changes your amounts a little bit, but not in any significant amount. And in most cases, even in D&D, the damage dice isn't the primary source of the damage, actually. There's just a bit of randomness. The main consistent source of damage is from the modifiers and the bonuses that you add onto it, right? Like a rogue with a dagger is rolling a d4, but they're also adding their dexterity to the damage. So they're already doing, 4 or 5 damage just from their modifier, and then the randomness is a d4. But compare that to like a sword, a d6 or a d8, that's only like on average 2 more damage. So it's really not, the dice doesn't really matter that much. It'll make it a little bit more swingy, but not, overall, it's a simplification that I like and I think makes sense, especially in this system. And the way Dungeon World also kind of had their own, they just assign you a dice and just everything just does that because it makes sense. And then you get your different nuances from the tags. So that's something that I think I like to see in a game. I like to just give me a weapon, and then it's easy to make, custom weapons or modify weapons as well, because now you just have a list of tags, and maybe you have a fighter and they have this like really heavy like battle axe, but they want to upgrade it so that it's not quite so heavy, and you let them, do some crafting checks, do whatever, and then now you can give it the light tag, or maybe you remove the heavy tag instead of giving it the light tag or something like that. You can change things fairly simply, and you can basically also come up with your own weapons really easily as well, right? You don't have to balance a whole bunch of stuff. Just like pick like what type of weapon is it, and then give it a couple, like 3 to 4 tags that describe the weapon, and just go from there. So that's one of the things that I like about the equipment and the weapons. The other thing that I like as far as simplification goes is kind of how he handles skills in this game, because there is only, for making a check, there's only the 6 main stats. You don't have like animal handling and perception and all of these other like little skills that are kind of sub skills underneath the main stats. You just roll the stats, but as you get more gear and stuff like that, you get bonuses to specific rolls that kind of are like ad hoc skills. So for example, the spyglass is +3 wisdom when scouting. So there doesn't need to be like it's kind of like a perception check. It's actually a little bit more specific than a perception check. But like if you're looking around specifically, you are scouting, right? Scouting is now like a skill because you get a bonus to it when you're trying to do that thing. So you get, you'd have your regular wisdom modifier, and now you get a +3 when you're scouting, right? So it makes you better at that specific skill. And it makes it, again, so you can kind of add in skills or specific things as needed, because you can just give them a bonus to one of whatever the main stat would have been, right? Like climbing. Let's say that's strength based. If you have climbing gear, you get a +2 when you're climbing. Oh yeah, it's the first one on the list. I wasn't even reading it. Rope and hook, +3 dex while climbing, right? It's kind of an ad hoc skill. Now there's climbing as a skill. Climbing isn't a skill in D&D, right? But now you have it here. And the character sheet doesn't have to get bogged down with all of these like random skills that like I don't think I've ever used animal handling, probably maybe once, and there's these skills, and it's kind of a debate on like, okay, which skills do you need and on your character sheet, and then like what happens if there's a situation where none of the skills on the sheet really correlate to the thing that you're trying to do, right? Then do you kind of go back and, okay, now it's just a strength check, because it's kind of that everything stems from the 6 stats, whether you're in D&D or ICRPG or whatever, right? But then you get additional bonuses that kind of extend out as you get more specific into what you're doing, right? So strength has a couple of things that you can be trained in, and dex has a couple of things that you can be trained in, whatever. And this just takes a lot of that out. You don't need it to clutter up your sheet. If you're good at animal handling, you just have a thing that says, hey, I get a bonus to whenever I try to do animal handling, whatever. It's something that I like. Again, it just simplifies things from a design standpoint and from like a character sheet standpoint. You only have to be concerned with your main stats and then any specific bonuses you have. And if you don't have bonuses to those things, it doesn't matter. It's not taking up space on your sheet. Again, you're just good to go. It's just more simple. I'm going to take this time to transition into talking about the monster stat blocks, because the monster stat blocks have a similar setup to that like skill rolls. They kind of have ad hoc skills or roll bonuses. When you're looking at a monster stat block in ICRPG, you've got a couple of things. You've got the name of the creature or monster. You have the health represented by hearts, and you have the roll bonuses and the actions that it has. And these are they're pretty simple. So I'm looking at the skeleton. So skeleton, it's 1 heart. 1 heart represents 10 effort or 10 health. And that's how pretty much everything is described. Like if we were talking about effort before, if you assigned a lock 1 heart, it would be 10 HP. Basically, you don't have to think about things as being super complicated for the number of health they have. Just give it a number multiplied by 10. So that's simple. Skeleton, 1 heart, it's got 10 health. It has a rolls section. It has +2 to all rolls. So all your stats, they get +2. All of your effort rolls also have +2. So that's important for determining damage. And then it's got some actions. It's got a weapon attack, so it can roll weapon effort. On a critical fail, the weapon breaks and it must resort to basic attacks, right? It's also got a death touch attack, making a normal strength attack. The skeleton grabs bare skin, burning it with cold blue fire. This causes magic damage. So there's a couple of different things here. And then there's like Spear Fighter. These are kind of like passive abilities, I guess. Most skeleton warriors employ a long spear and fight at near range, so they can hit targets a little bit farther away. They're really slow as death. A skeleton can never move far in an action, clumsily plods along. And then there's a handful of other things as well, right? So they're just describing the creature and different kind of things that it can do. I'm going to take a look at a different monster now just to kind of compare some of the different things that the stats can have. So I'm now looking at the ogre. It's got 4 hearts, so 40 HP. The rolls are a little bit different here. So it's got +8 strength, -3 intelligence, -3 charisma, +3 to all other rolls. And in some of the other examples, when you kind of page through the monsters in the book, they'll have things like plus a certain amount to effort rolls, or just to stats, which is all stats, or, plus to all rolls, or plus to, or minuses to whatever. And it's really fast to write that down, right? It's kind of that same situation as the skills where it's only the things that are relevant are on the stat sheet. I don't have every single thing listed. I don't have all of the effort listed. I don't have all of the stats listed. I only have the ones that are different, right? Ogre, +8 strength. All right, roll it. +3 to everything else. Okay, what am I rolling? Is it on my first 3 list? Is it strength, enter, charisma? No? Okay, it's +3, right? I don't have to think super hard when I'm looking at it. It's really easy to write down. You could simplify pretty much every single D&D monster to have this same format, right? You just look at the ones that are all the same and lump them together into one. Or basically, you look at all the ones that are different and you pull those out. And it's just a little bit simpler. One other thing that this has that the skeleton didn't have it, but this actually shows up on a number of monsters, is a number of actions. So actions takes 2 actions per turn. There are some that take 3 actions. There are some that take more. This is dependent on the monster, like legendary or bigger monsters get just additional actions that they can take. And that is the monsters. It's super simple. It's so easy to just come in and just throw something together. Again, the simplicity of this can be stolen for D&D if you just condense rolls. Even if you're looking at a stat block in D&D and there's a lot of things that are different, you can simplify those down a little bit, right? If like half of the stats are like +1 or +2, just lump them all. Just give them all +1 or +2. Just pick one of the numbers and just lump them all in, right? Like it's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a change. Homebrew it, whatever. You're going to be fine. The numbers aren't going to come out, especially if you're just tweaking them a little bit. They're not going to matter that much. In the book, he also has some charts for making monsters and just kind of ideas of different abilities that you can give them, like trap them. Monster can grapple, immobilize, incapacitate, usually countered with opposing strength rolls, right? Like, and then there's a whole bunch of these. Or destroy gear. Wait, what? Yep, monster can destroy equipment. So, you can give them these different things, and you can either like roll on this as a table to create your monsters, but just a really good resource, and really honestly going through any of the monsters and just grabbing like abilities that sound cool and putting them into your own monster. Super easy to do. One of my favorite things about ICRPG is that it's so hackable. You can really come up with pretty much whatever you want or whatever you need. If you didn't have a monster for a situation, or you encounter a random monster and you didn't have a stat block prepared, you could throw something together in like 5 minutes that would be, decent. You might not get all of the kind of flavorful, pieces in 5 minutes, but you could write down a handful of abilities. You could have the like core stats and stuff figured out. It's really not that complicated. I'm going to circle back a little bit to the player characters and talk about the main stats that they have here. Now that we've talked about effort and everything, and kind of how you actually create characters. So super simple. We have the 6 stats that we mentioned, and then we've got the 4 types of effort. And then you also have an armor class. They just call it armor in ICRPG, but it's effectively your armor class. When you roll up a character in ICRPG, all you have to do is take into account those, handful of stats that you have, and you get to assign 6 points to any of those stats. So you could, if you wanted to make your armor class be 16, you could put all of your points into your armor and have no bonuses anywhere else. It'd be super, just like a beefy dude. Or you can spread them across your stats to make your rolls better. You can spread them across your effort to make your attempts hit harder. And that's really it. In any combination, you can split those 6 up. You can put them all in one. You can split them up in any combination. It's so fast. It's so simple. You don't have to do like a ton of math and roll a bunch of dice and then like calculate modifiers. And it's just put the points where you want them. And it's super simple. Then you also start with 1 heart. So, like we talked about, 1 heart is 10 hit points. You can get more hearts as you kind of quote unquote level up through different items, although that is typically a rare reward. That is not something that you're going to be getting every time you level up. You're not increasing your health very frequently at all. Another thing about the character classes, I guess, or just kind of like the I know when I talked to him, he wasn't sure if he really liked the way that he has classes set up, but I actually kind of like the way that it's set up, in that basically everything in the game, every upgrade in the game is a piece of gear, it's a piece of loot, it's some kind of an item. It's something that you physically have. And the thing that I think is interesting about this is that because it's all equipment based, you get a couple of extra things out of it, right? You can now potentially lose or have your gear damaged, which could be a problem. You also can mix and match things. So you can kind of fill multiple roles or fill very specific roles depending on what gear you find or what gear you go out and make, right? Like you might be a rogue, but you could maybe find some cool magic gear and you transition into kind of a like an arcane rogue or something, or maybe you dabble with a lot of poisons and stuff. You get a lot of the like the subclasses and stuff from D&D. It's just a matter of what gear you're after, what gear you find. Well, when you level up in this game, you typically there is classes in the game, and each class essentially has a list of like 6 to 7 items or pieces of gear that kind of make sense for that class, right? So like the shadow class is like the rogue. They've got thief boots, so when you're rolling stealth, you only fail when you roll a 1. Or the thieves gimbal, when rolling a natural 20 attack, you can also roll for loot, and you can basically steal something. You get, there's different things like that are related specifically to how that class would play, but they're not. It's not saying that these things couldn't go to somebody else. And effectively, they're milestone rewards. It's milestone leveling. When you hit that milestone, that level up, you basically get to pick one of the items on your kind of milestone reward list as a class, and then you just like get that item, or you maybe have to come up with some story reason as to why you got it. But then again, it's milestone leveling, so something big happened, so it should be fairly easy to explain why you all of a sudden have this thing. You made it, you found it, you stole it, whatever. And so the rewards are all equipment, they're all gear, even going so far as to say that spells are just items. Like spells are pages in a spell book, or runes, or something like that. I think he does talk a little bit about there are certain powers. I think it's like the wisdom powers. You actually can integrate with, or that's not maybe the right word, but you kind of like absorb them, where they just become part of you, where you can't lose them. But it's also, how do you gain new spells? Oh, it's just a level up thing that you can get, right? And if I were doing this, the other thing you get out of it is that you can upgrade things as well, right? Like if everything is gear, then you can mess with gear, you can tinker with gear, you can upgrade gear, right? So if you, as the shadow again, weird masks is one of them, so +3 charisma when deceiving a stranger. Maybe when you level up, you really like those masks and they come in handy a lot, so you just add, instead of getting a new item, you just add some additional tag or some additional ability on it. Maybe it's +4 when deceiving strangers, or maybe you add a little bit of text that says they don't remember the encounter after, on a successful check, the people you deceived don't even remember that it happened, right? Like you can just add little bits like that. Another cool thing about having it be equipment, because when it's like D&D and you have these abilities, they're usually pretty rigid, which is fine. But it just gives you flexibility in how you level up. I always think back to Terraria, a video game, And all of the progression in Terraria is loot based as well. Nothing is permanent, and if you, it's kind of silly, but if you wanted to like completely redo your class, like you didn't like what you were, like where you went or what you were doing, I mean, besides your stats are permanent, but everything else you can just be like, I don't really like being a thief anymore. So then you swap your gear out for fighter gear, right? And maybe slowly you switch over to that kind of thing. It doesn't, the path that you're on doesn't have to be the path you're on forever. It can change. You can upgrade it. You can do different things. Again, spells, kind of the same thing. Getting a new spell is just getting a new. It's you're unlocking this massive amount of power by learning a new spell. It's no different than getting a magical sword or something like that. One piece I forgot to mention is that when you do character creation, you do get to pick a bioform. This is your like kind of the replacement name for like your race. And I think he uses this because bioform makes sense also in Warp Shell, which is the kind of sci-fi variant of ICRPG. And effectively, the bioforms, the races, whatever, they just give you basically +1 to 2 different things, and maybe a short little, description about kind of where they come from or what they're known for. But then I think in the Warp Shell bioforms, you have some different things like the Reptoid, which is just a reptilian lizard folk type person. They get +1 dex, they have heat vision, and any surface is considered walkable for them, so they can climb up walls and stuff, right? So these are really just innate abilities that kind of a bonus, a couple of bonuses, or a bonus and an innate ability that they can have. Again, super easy to modify these to come up with new ones. I mean, if you wanted to have a Aarakocra or something, you could put +1 to dex and can fly because you have wings, right? Like, it's super easy to just write new ones. Actually, there is in the Warp Shell, there's a bioform that is essentially a human, and they just get +2 to any stats. Any stat you want, +1 to any 2 stats. So much like D&D, it's just the generic. You can just put 2 stats anywhere, and you're good to go. That's really all the bioforms are. And I'm essentially just kind of reading through the PDF or skimming it as I'm talking about this. I just got to this section on spells, and we were talking about how spells can kind of be gear. One thing that also happens when you're casting a spell is you have to roll for it. Just like weapon attacks, just like attempts, it's all the same. I don't understand it in D&D why, like, for certain spells you don't actually have to roll for them, like they can just happen, which seems counterintuitive when magic, the thing that goes against physics and alters reality, is more consistent than trying to stab something with a sword in terms of like the difficulty of things. So just like any other check, any other attack, attempt, check, whatever, you have to roll your dice, you have to make your check, and you have to beat the target number. He also has spells split out into kind of 2 different sections. You have wisdom powers, which is more like druid, cleric, monk, paladin type spells like turn undead, iron palm, elemental air, different things like that. And then those are all based on the wisdom stat. And then you have int spells, intelligence, arcane arts. So magic missile, fireball, doorway creates a magical door. I think that's the dimension door equivalent, and stuff like that. And those are all on the intelligence side of things. And they're basically just split out into those 2. And anybody can get these, right? Like a monk would get the iron palm. You get an extra, your next 1d4 unarmed attacks have +3 to the attempt and do ultimate effort. That's awesome. Get some nice strong hits in. And this is pretty much the entire rule set of ICRPG. in just a short time, I've been able to describe pretty much how to run the entire game. It's super simple. It makes sense for people who maybe get into the hobby from D&D. It's easy to hack. A lot of the things just make sense. They feel like kind of natural conclusions of the system. Like the attempts are just an extension of combat rolls. And a lot of the things are simplified. To me, ICRPG is like the streamlined D&D, right? We talked about how it kind of gets rid of all of the skills and just makes them kind of one-offs depending on your gear. All of your level up stuff is loot based, and it's easy to make loot. It's easy to come up with stuff. One of the ways that they speed things up is by using that room or encounter target number, so you always know what you're rolling against in a given room. And as you like progress deeper into the dungeon or your characters are getting more tired, that dice is gonna ratchet up. Now there's one note, I don't know exactly where it is in here, but I remember reading it and like, okay, I'm gonna set the room difficulty to 12. Now that's not a very high number, but the dice will do the dirty work. They will make your characters fail way more often than they should, even on these lower numbers. So don't be deceived by setting low difficulty classes for your target number for your encounters. 12, your characters are going to fail doing basic stuff. But as you get into like the boss fights and all this stuff, things are going to ratchet up, things are going to get harder. And I don't think I mentioned it, but this makes sense even in D&D, right? You're getting more tired. More things are happening too, right? Like if you're fighting some type of like lava elemental or something, and like the room is on fire, and there's stuff falling from the ceiling, and there's lava geysers and stuff. Like just trying to survive in that room is much more difficult than standing in the open on a road in like a grassland, right? Like doing anything, trying to attack something, trying to climb something is going to be not infinitely, but more difficult to accomplish in one of the settings than it is in the other settings. So having everything be based on that target number just makes a lot of sense. The only time that something is not rolling against the target number is when monsters are attacking the players. Then the monsters have to roll against the player's armor class. But that is the only time. Players trying to hit monsters, you have to beat the room target, the encounter target. And it makes a lot of sense. It's fast. It is easy for you. You can make things easy or hard, giving him a +3 or -3, or just do what I would do and just throw advantage in, because who doesn't love rolling extra dice? We talked about attempts. We talked about the weapon tags. Weapons do the same amount of damage because the dice doesn't really matter that much. They're just differentiated based on tags they have. It also means that you can upgrade them and change them easily. We talked about the skills and the monsters. So you don't have to have all the skills on the character sheet to make them relevant. Give them bonuses to random specific things and just have it be that way. The players only have to care about what's actually on their sheet and nothing more. And health is low. Everything is gear based. It's just a good system. It's streamlined to D&D. To me, you could run pretty much anything in this system really easily and without a ton of prep, or you could port pretty much any system or more so genre over to this very quickly without needing to find a new rule system or whatever. If there's a movie that you love and there's not a role-playing game for it, which at this rate, with how quickly major IP is having tabletop games developed for them, maybe there is a game for you. But if you just want something that's like D&D but set in XYZ universe, then ICRPG, and you can hack this thing together super quick. And you can hack together just the stuff you need to run the next session. You don't even have to build the whole thing out, right? You're not coming up with dice mechanics or whatever. It's just your nuts and bolts hackable system. So ICRPG was one of the first games that I found after being introduced to D&D, and I really like it, especially as a game master. Obviously, I'm kind of raving about it, but definitely check it out. I didn't really go over any of the game master sections. He has a lot of great sections about creating adventures, creating encounters, and how to do that. He's got random tables. The book has a ton of just kind of pre-written like snippet adventures too, that just have like a bunch of adventure hooks and like a handful of NPCs and a handful of locations and different things that people might want to do. He's got adventure generators. He talks about room design. That's also a good one. I'm not going to go into it. It's hard because he has pictures, but he describes different scenarios, like having to double back for things, or having encounter archetypes, he calls them. So like the siege or the tightrope or the duel. These are all kind of like taking common encounter things, ambush, and distilling it into what is the core component of that encounter type, and then how can you add different enemies to change it? How can you change the terrain around it to do different things? Very good section. There's a lot of different encounter types, and they all have drawings with them so that you can see kind of like how a map would be set up to facilitate that type of encounter. He also talks about something that we talked about in the interview last week, was the 3 T's: the threat, the treat, and the timer. And so something bad, something good, and then just, rolling a D4 or D6 and saying, in 1D4 rounds, the bridge collapses. So figure your life out, because you only got so many rounds to deal with things. And he also goes into a lot of things that should be happening with the environment. You shouldn't have these static rooms that don't change. You should be having, things break or be destroyed, or maybe be constructed, or rituals being completed, or whatever, that, wind blowing that makes people have to make a dex check every couple of rounds, to not fall off the bridge. And there are just so many good pieces of advice in this book for just even creating encounters, creating sessions, location, goal, obstacle. He's got charts. So here's where the thing is, here's what the goal is, and here's what's, standing in your way, and talking about the narrative techniques, the mechanical techniques of getting through those, and just how to really game mastery, and how to kind of come up with all this stuff. So I think this is where I'm going to cut the episode. I could probably find more to talk about, but I think we covered a lot, and I hope that you guys have some stealable mechanics that you can use in your game, even if you just find 1 or 2 of these things really useful. I know that a lot of the things in here have helped me just to simplify my brain as a GM when I'm running a game, because there's a lot going on, and simple is usually easier for me to run, which means better time at the table. So I appreciate you guys for listening. Please comment or message me on Twitter or Discord and tell me what your favorite mechanic from this was, or if you have any special mechanics that stand out, and what you're thinking. If there's something that you think you could steal here, let me know what it is. I'd just like to talk about it with you further. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast. You can find links to all of the products and resources that we talked about on the show in the show notes. And if you'd like to join the community or find out how to be on the show, check out our subreddit or join us in our Discord server.